Welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to see the central concept in political science, which is sovereignty. Which is sovereignty. Sovereignty, right? What is sovereignty? Sovereignty is nothing but absolute power in hands of state, right? Sovereign, sovereign. This is the origin of the word sovereignty, and what it means. It means that it in English it means supreme authority, right? Recently we have seen what is authority. It is legitimate power, and sovereignty is supreme legitimate power, right? Authority can be in hands of DM, can be in hands of Sarpanch, can be in hands of CM, can be in hands of PM as well. But the supreme political authority in India lies in hand of PM, right? So sovereignty is a political concept which talks about what is the supreme authority, right? And and the concept of sovereignty is of two types: internal sovereignty and external sovereignty. Internal sovereignty in we'll see right now in this lecture. External sovereignty will be seen in theories of international relations, in concepts like responsibility to protect. In concept of sovereignty, we are going to see sovereignty in international relations as well, right? Where we will understand UN Charter second clause seventh point, right? Seventh subclause. There we will understand meaning of external sovereignty. Right now we will be limited to internal sovereignty, right? So internal sovereignty. Internal sovereignty. The first scholar which gave idea of internal sovereignty was Hobbes, right? Hobbes was the first modern thinker. Why? Because he gave complete theory of sovereignty. He gave complete theory of sovereignty, whereby state is the most superior authority within a territory, right? So Hobbes gives theory of internal sovereignty. In external sovereignty, we have people like Hugo Grotius, and people like Hugo Grotius talks about external sovereignty and how external sovereignty works. Hugo Grotius is father of international law. He is father of international law. In effort of understanding sovereignty, the first principle or the first theory that we are going to see is monistic theory of sovereignty. Of sovereignty. What is monistic theory of sovereignty? It is basically Austinian theory of sovereignty. It is Austinian theory of sovereignty, right? What does Austinian theory of sovereignty say? It says that on a particular territory, right? On a particular territory, and on a particular territory, and on, sorry, I missed, on a particular territory, and on particular population. On a particular territory, on a particular population, ultimate power, ultimate authority lies with state. Who gave this idea? Who was the first person to give this idea? It was Hobbes. Hobbes was the first person to give monistic theory of sovereignty, right? Monistic theory of sovereignty. On a particular territory, on a particular population, state has ultimate power, and and it is the first theory of sovereignty. Monistic theory of sovereignty or Austinian theory of sovereignty is first theory of sovereignty. It talks about sovereignty in a singular sense, that only singular entity has power, that only a singular entity has power. Who gave this theory? Who gave this theory? It was John Austin. John Austin, in his book Lectures on Jurisprudence. In his book Lectures on Jurisprudence, John Austin gave his theory of sovereignty. His theory of sovereignty. Right? So what does he mean by monistic theory of sovereignty or Austinian theory of sovereignty? We understand his theory of sovereignty by his definition of sovereignty in his book. Right? He says that if a determinate human superior, an entity which can be determined and is superior to human, right? If a entity which is if a determinate human superior, entity which is human superior, right? I will start this quote on the next page. If a determinate human superior, right? Then he says that not in the habit of not in the habit of obedience to like superior. If a determinate human superior, not in the habit of not in the habit of obedience to like superior, obedience to like superior, right? receives 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 habitual receives habitual obedience from bulk of society, right? Then then the human superior is called sovereign, and such society is called political society. Only such society is political society, right? Only such society is political society. So I will break this quote down word by word. This quote explains this quote explains what monistic sovereignty wants to say. It wants to say that, right? I will utter the quote one more time, that if a determinate human superior, not in the habit of obedience to like superior, receives habitual obedience from the bulk of the society, then the human superior is called sovereign, and such society is called political society. Right? I will start with explanation. If a determinate human superior, what does this mean? What does determinate mean? We can pinpoint this person or this entity. Human superior means state. If a state which can be pinpointed, right? Not in the habit of obedience to like superior, which means that that state is ultimate authority within a territory, right? State within territory do not pay obedience to a different superior, right? Not in the habit of obedience to like superior, receives habitual obedience from the bulk of the society. What does this mean? This means that whatever law state makes, people or society will obey them, right? If all these conditions are fulfilled, that a pinpointed human superior, that is state, which is ultimate authority within a territory, and such state when makes laws, have people obeying them, society obeying them, then such human superior is called sovereign, right? And such society which has a sovereign is called as political society. Only such society which has sovereign is called as political society, right? What does this mean? If a society has a sovereign, then only, right? What does this mean? This means four things, right? If society has sovereign, then only it is political. It is political society, right? What it means that sovereign or determinate human superior don't have to obey external or internal authority, right? And what it means that within a territory, sovereign has ultimate word. Whatever sovereign say is the law, right? These are the implications of it. I will say the quote one more time so that you will be able to understand it in more detail. If a determinate human superior means we can pinpoint the origin of the authority, not in the habit of obedience to like superior, which means state is ultimate authority within a territory, receives habitual obedience from bulk of society, which means whatever law state makes will have obedience from bulk of the society. Then if all these conditions are satisfied, pinpointed human superior, not having any other authority over it, and within its territory most of the people will follow it, then such human superior is called sovereign. And a society having human superior, a determinate human superior, is state, right? So if a society has a sovereign, if the society has determinate human superior, then that society is political society. What other implication that comes out of it is that sovereign don't have to obey word of anyone else. And the third implication is that sovereign has ultimate word within its territory, right? That means law is command of sovereign. Law is command of sovereign. This is quote of Austin. Law is command of sovereign, right? So what it means, that authority authority it is centralized. It means that authority is with whom, is with sovereign, and sovereign has ultimate authority. And sovereign which is centralized having ultimate authority, all these things, sovereignty which is centralized, it is basically Austinian theory, and you can also write it as Hobbesian theory, right? Hobbes also said exactly the same thing, right? So based on based on these principles, that within a territory there will be no other entity which will have its say on the state, There is no other entity within the state or outside the state which will have any authority over the state, right? So state is basically ultimate authority. What happens when you give ultimate authority to one entity, right? So criticism of monistic theory of sovereignty. What is criticism, right? If you give power, if you give power and ultimate power to someone, right? Sovereign can become two things. First, ultimate power can lead to totalitarianism, and ultimate power can also lead to another thing, which is corruption, because power corrupts, uh, and ultimate power corrupts more. Power corrupts, as said by Lord Acton. Power corrupts, right? So sovereign can become totalitarian, and sovereign can become corrupt because power corrupts, right? The second criticism of monistic theory of sovereignty was monistic theory had this one idea within it whereby the state is ultimate authority, right? State don't have any other entity which has authority over it. What is the problem in this situation? If a state which is led by a person like Hitler used the ultimate power that he had for the purposes which were not really sane, which were not peaceful. So Hitler followed an expansionist foreign policy. He said that his goal is to expand German empire within the Europe and across the world, right? So monistic theory, while giving ultimate authority to the state, forgets that when you give ultimate authority to someone, such person, how that person will use that authority is not really guaranteed. So this is second criticism of monistic theory. First criticism is that state can become totalitarian. Second criticism is that state can go for war because it is the ultimate authority. That it can be a threat for international peace. Right? What what monistic theory tries to do? It basically, what was the ultimate idea behind theory of two swords as given by Machiavelli? Machiavelli says that what does Machiavelli say? That state have ultimate power, right? Within church and state, who is more powerful? Machiavelli says that it is state. Hobbes says that within a territory, state is ultimate power. So monistic theory was useful in the context of theory of two swords, right? In medieval times, when church had a lot of power, this monistic theory of sovereignty made sense. But post World War II, between World War II, before World War II, monistic theory of sovereignty led to things like Holocaust as state became totalitarian. Monistic theory of sovereignty led to things like World War II, because state was ultimate authority. If state is ultimate authority, whatever it wants to do, it can do. So it led to things like war. Hitler followed his expansionist foreign policy, and that is there, right? So this is criticism of monistic theory of sovereignty, right? I have just explained that whenever a entity has ultimate power, it gets corrupted. And when a state has ultimate power within its border, outside its border, what happens is that state goes for wars, right? This this is the limitation in monistic theory of sovereignty, whereby Hitler and people like Hitler went for war. And monistic theory of sovereignty led to things like Holocaust, led to things like pogrom of Jews, pogrom is basically mass killings, pogrom of Jews. Then it led to World War One and World War Two because people like Hitler thought they had ultimate power. We have seen Mussolini saying there is nothing about state, there is nothing beyond state, right? State is ultimate entity. So this was the issue with monistic theory of sovereignty. What is the solution? The solution lies in pluralist theory of sovereignty. What was the issue? There were two issues with monistic theory of sovereignty. First is that state can become totalitarian and or corrupt. And the second issue was that state can go for war, as seen in situations like World War One and World War Two happened because people like Mussolini and people like Hitler thought they can go for war because they had ultimate authority, right? This lead to this lead to people like Lasky and McIver framing pluralist theory of sovereignty. With ultimate power in hands of state, what happens is that state started acting in a such a way that it is not right. Right? State become totalitarian or state become corrupt. You must have known things like Holocaust or mass killings of Jews. So violation of rights happened between interwar period between World War One and World War Two. Even though that happened, nobody could say anything about that because state was seen as ultimate entity, right? And because of Austinian view on sovereignty that state has ultimate sovereignty, state started going for wars. People like Mussolini say there is nothing beyond state, there is nothing about state, right? So these two issues were there. First was totalitarianism, and second was states going for war and states threatening international peace, right? So because of these two things, wars and totalitarianism, people formulated a new theory of sovereignty, which is pluralist theory of sovereignty, pluralist theory, or functionalist theory of sovereignty. Functionalist theory. Understanding word and etymology becomes very important, right? Pluralist, right? What is the origin word? Plural. What is the original origin word of functionalist? Functionalism or functional, right? What is the difference between monistic theory of sovereignty and pluralist theory of sovereignty? Monistic theory of sovereignty will say that there is only one determinate human superior. Pluralist theory will say this is not true. There are not one centers of power, but multiple centers of power, right? A type of federal view on power, almost federal view, right? Almost federal view. What is functionalist? What this functional word means here? This means that authority or power will be distributed on functional lines, right? It is the function which matters. Authority or power will be distributed on functional lines. So, this is the meaning of pluralism. Pluralism basically means that plural word here basically means that there are multiple centers of power, and these multiple centers of power, in these multiple centers of power, how will authority or power will be distributed? It will be distributed on functional lines. If you have a function in particular thing, power will be given to you, right? This plural view or multiple centers of power or functional view of power, it is not something new, right? We have actually seen concept like theory of two swords, right? It is not two swords, it is basically multiple swords. In Machiavelli, if you remember, in Machiavelli, if you remember, what happens is that, right? Uh, in Machiavelli, if you remember, what happens is that in Machiavelli, if you remember, what happens is that there is church, there is state, and there is feudal authority. If you remember, there were five houses in Italy. So authority was with multiple centers of power. So authority was not pinpointed to a person, right? Authority was plural. That state had some power, church had some power, and feudal authority had some power, right? So pluralist theory, not a new idea, not a new idea. It is historical idea, right? In history, it was needed that in history it was needed it was needed that two theory of sorts to be resolved. But but today, what is needed? It is plural plural power centers, multiple power centers. Why? If you give all the power to one person, that person will be corrupted, and that state will go for things like war, and international peace will be threatened, right? So, so what it means that this was a plural system. This was a plural system. Plural system basically means that there were multiple centers of power. Plural system means only this much, that there were multiple centers of power, right? And today we see examples like EU, right? EU has a common central bank in Brussels, EU has common courts and EU has common parliament, right? So state, right? I will make a map of Europe and try to make you understand what do I mean by this, right? I will make a small map of Europe, right? So, and this is English channel. This is France. Hmm, a very bad map. So this is Iberian Peninsula, this is France, this is Spain, and this is Portugal, right? Let's suppose only these much countries are in EU, right? So Britain is not in EU right now, so Britain will not consider. So which countries are in EU? So there is Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. There is Portugal, mm, Spain, and France, right? And multiple are there. I'm not going to name them all. Let's just assume this many countries are in EU, right? So I will take an example of France. France has one center of power, which is its government, French government. France has other center of power, which is EU Parliament. France has other center of power, which is EU Central Bank, right? So for French government, you have other authorities which have some power over it. This is basically pluralist theory of power. Understood, right? Whereby all the power is not with French government, but some power is with European Parliament, some power is with European Central Bank. So there are multiple centers of power. In French state, not all power is with French government. This is basically pluralist theory of power. Pluralism basically means multiple, right? So pluralist theory of power basically means that there are multiple centers of power, right? To understand pluralist theory or multiple centers of power theory in more detail, we will start with this scholar Lasky. Lasky we have seen before in Liberty, in Ideology. Lasky was someone who influenced Lasky was someone who influenced Jawaharlal Nehru, and Lasky was an idealist scholar. Right? Lasky was someone who is Kantian, who is Aristotelian. Right? He he was an idealist. He was an idealist scholar, and he was an Oxford School scholar as well. Right? I will give you some background of him as well. Right? And Lasky, as he was idealist, was very much inspired by Aristotle and people like Kant. You see influence of Aristotle and Kant in in Lasky, right? I will start with this quote of Aristotle, whereby Aristotle says that state is an association between who? Between the people, between the institutions. State is an association. Aristotle. Aristotle said this. On basis of this quote, what does Lasky say? Lasky says that, right? Very philosophically, Lasky says that universe universe is multidimensional. Universe is multidimensional, right? Man is part of universe. If universe is multidimensional, man will also be multidimensional, right? Man will also be a man is also multidimensional. If man is multidimensional, right, needs 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 of man are also multidimensional, right? And as Aristotle said that universe is an association, Lasky will say only one association, only one association cannot fulfill all the needs of man, right? Because man is part of universe, universe is multidimensional, and needs of man are also multidimensional. That is why state cannot fulfill all the needs of man, right? A man is a part of family, man is working somewhere, man is living in a society, man follows a religion, and man is a citizen resident of a state, right? Man have all these dimensions, or women have all these dimensions. If man have all these dimension, how can state say that I will have authority over each and every aspect of man? It cannot be true, right? So so what does Lasky say? Lasky says that only one association, that is state, cannot fulfill all of man's needs. If only one association cannot fulfill all of man's needs, then cannot state cannot claim absolute obedience from the man. If state cannot fulfill all the needs of man, why do state expects that man will be giving all his obedience to state, right? So ultimate obedience or absolute obedience cannot be expected by state, and some authority should be delegated to not delegated is wrong word here, should be bestowed upon bestowed upon other associations as well, right? Some authority should be given to bestowed upon other association as well, like family, like workplace, like society, and like religion. All of the obedience should not be expected by state, right? All of the obedience cannot be expected by state. This view is also known as functionalist view, right? Why pluralist view? Very simply because there are multiple centers of power. Why it is called functionalist view? Because functions and authority So given determines center of power, right? Functions determine what authority should be given to a center of power. Pluralism basically means there are multiple centers of power. Functionalism means what authority should be given to that center of power. What, and it will be determined on functions. Like what authority should be given to a center of power, right? And such authority will be determined on basis of functions. This is functionalist view and this is pluralist view, right? Very common example, very common example is of central banks, right? And we can use other examples as well. We can use examples of, let's say, SEBI, or we can use example of Election Commission of India, or any election commission around the world, right? Okay, I will just draw a brief diagram on system of Indian state, right? System of Indian state. System of Indian state on legislative side has parliament. On executive side has government. Government which is elected, and government which is selected in form of bureaucracy. And on adjudication side you see courts, right? You see courts. So in system of Indian state you see three centers of power, right? Because Indian states has three centers of power, it is a pluralist system. But why it is functionalist system? Why this sovereignty is functionalist sovereignty? Because parliament has its power depending upon function it performs. Parliament has one power which is legislation. Parliament has authority of legislation. Elected government and selected government has function of execution, and courts have function of adjudication, right? So authority is divided on functional lines, right? There are multiple centers of power. This is pluralist view, and between these multiple centers of power authority is given as per their functions. This is functionalist view, right? So if I have to make Venn diagram, I will make Venn diagram like this is pluralist view, this is pluralism in sovereignty, and this is functionalism in sovereignty, right? So this is the difference between pluralism and functionalism. Then, then we are going to understand. Then we are going to understand. Till now we have seen pluralist theory of sovereignty, right? Now we are going to understand Lasky, Lasky's view on sovereignty. What Lasky said about sovereignty. To start with, I must mention that Lasky was an internationalist, right? He, he by internationalism, what I mean, Lasky was an internationalist. He says that he says that the power, the power with the state should not be ultimate. If power with the state is ultimate, then that with that ultimate power, states can do things like Holocaust and things like World War. So international, there should be an international community which has some power to it. So Lasky is an internationalist, right? Because Lasky is an internationalist, there is this quote of Gramsci which I must mention, whereby he says that it would be of great benefit, it would be of great benefit to the discipline of political science if idea of sovereignty of state is expunged out of discipline, right? Right? Sovereignty to be expunged, expunged out of political science. It would be a great benefit to the discipline of political science if sovereignty is expunged out of it, right? If sovereignty is expunged out of it. How does Lasky justifies this statement? Right? This is a very strong statement, and this idea of sovereignty is not a peripheral idea in political science. Idea of sovereignty is very central to the idea of state and very central to the idea of political science. So why does Lasky says that idea of sovereignty should be expunged, should be taken out, should be uh, left out of concept of discipline of political science? Why does he says that? He says that sovereignty as we understand, or the sovereignty which Lasky criticizes, is monastic sovereignty, monastic or Austinian sovereignty. This is the type of sovereignty that Lasky criticizes, monastic or Austinian. He says that the first thing that he says is that monastic or Austinian sovereignty is textual. It is a theory of law. It is not contextual. I will explain with an example. Okay? He says that monastic or Austinian theory is legal, not legal, and not contextual or political. Right? It is not a theory which has practical relevance on ground, right? Which has practical relevance on ground. Why does Lasky say so? Why does he says that Austinian theory has no practical relevance? That it is only textual, it is only legal, not contextual, not political, right? Why does he says that? Right? He says that because things like, right, I will give you an extreme example of child marriage in Rajasthan. Child marriage in Rajasthan, right? By as per law given by state, child marriages in Rajasthan are are illegal. But if you have if you have uh, if you have heard about Bhavri Devi case, right, you will understand society, and you will understand customs have as much importance as state. Even though child marriage in India are illegal, right? But they are just textual, seen in context of society and customs of Rajasthan, you will see futility of such law. Right? There was a social worker known as Bhauri Devi. Right? On a particular on Tej, right? On Tej. Tej is a big Marwadi festival. On Tej, there are a lot of child marriages that happen in Rajasthan. So what does Bhauri Devi do? Bhauri Devi goes in that area and tries to persuade the people of that area to not to do child marriages. And she says that if you do child marriages, I will report an FIR against you. What that society do? They don't have fear of law which is textual. What does that society do? That society rapes Bhauri Devi. All of the men present in that functions present at that time, they all rape Bhauri Devi and they leave her like that. They make an example out of her. So you understand how sovereignty of state is futile if people are not going to follow them. Right? If people are not ready to follow the sovereignty, if people are not ready to follow the text, the laws, then that law becomes futile. If people are not ready to follow a certain law, if you remember Hobbes, what does Hobbes say? Hobbes say that if someone is not following a law, that person is also sovereign. And by that logic, you can understand what is the futility of sovereignty, right? How sovereignty becomes a farce, how sovereignty becomes a thing of mockery if people are not ready to follow them, right? To explain or to give more weight to his argument, Lasky has said one or two things. He has analyzed, first, he has analyzed federal government, right? Federal government, he says that with emergence of federal government, monistic theory is no longer true because within a state, within a nation, there are multiple centers of power, right? Federal government is also an example of pluralist theory, functionalist theory, right? The second thing that Lasky says that if state is not able to justify its superiority, then state must leave such power. If state is not able to justify such authority, state has no right. State should justify its authority. If state does not have justification for using such a big authority, then it cannot be given absolute authority. And the third thing that Lasky says that state is just an association. It is just an association and so can't or cannot claim absolute power. State is just an association and cannot claim absolute power. Right? This is how he justified his theory of sovereignty. But what is the issue with Lasky? Right? What is the issue with Lasky? He is inconsistent. Right? He has given a good theory, and it is a very relevant theory in the sense that state do not have an absolute say always, right? There are always some authority which will have some say in functioning of state. So Lasky's theory is first right. He has a good theory, but issue with Lasky is that he is inconsistent or paradoxical, right? He has said that state is just an institution. He has says that society has multiple centers of power. Society is plural, right? First thing he says that society is federal. There are multiple centers of power, which is pluralism, right? Right. This is what he says. On one hand, he says that there are multiple centers of power, and with coming of federal entities, we can see that there are multiple centers of power. This he says on one hand. On the other hand, he says that there is this very big and famous quote of Lasky, whereby he says that state is the keystone of social architecture. Right? This what does this statement means? While saying that there are multiple associations, while saying that centers of power are plural, while saying that power is given to entities, power is given to centers of power uh, on basis of functions, he says that state is the keystone of social architecture, and he says that why it is a keystone. What do I mean by keystone? He means that it is most important association. Why state is the keystone? Why state is the most important association? Because it performs most important function. What is the function of state? What is the function of state? The function of state is the resolution of conflicts. Right? State performs the most important function, which is resolution of conflicts, and that is why Lasky says that state is keystone of social architecture. State is most important association. This is the paradoxical or paradoxicality of Lasky, or inconsistency in Lasky. Right? This paradoxical view of Lasky, or this inconsistency of Lasky, was solved by the scholar we are going to study now, who is McIver. McIver McIver solves inconsistency in Lasky with respect to pluralist theory of state. Right? Just now we have seen what does Lasky say. Lasky says that state is keystone. That state is most important association, because state performs the most important function. Right? So McIver, we have just seen Lasky. Lasky says that state is most important association. State is the keystone of social architecture. Right? For Lasky, state is keystone of social architecture. McIver, on the other hand, says that state state is just like any other association. State is just like any other association. There is not much difference between state and any other center of power. All perform equal function. State is like just another association, right? Mackay was not a political scientist, he was a sociologist. He was a sociologist. And McIver was extreme pluralist, right? Lasky Lasky keeps some elements of sovereignty, some elements of importance to state. McIvers discard all of them. McIver says that state is just like any other association. McIver is a sociologist, and McIver says that the function that state performs is not the most important function. It is not the most important function. Right? Function that state performs is not the most important function. Right? As state is not performing the most important function. That is why state is not state is not superior in any way to any other institution or any other association. For Lasky, state is most important association. McIver says that no, state is not most important association. State is like any other association, and the function that state performs is not really that important, right? And McIver says that for McIver, for McIver, church, for McIver, kinship group. Kinship group basically means blood groups. You are related to kind or a type of people by blood, right? Like you are a Christian, you are a white Christian, you will be related to white Christians in some or other way. So you are, sorry, not you are, but associations like church and kinship group have more important than state. They are performing more important functions than state. State's function of conflict resolution is not the most important, but associations like church and kinship group are performing better functions. And for this, he gives concept of service state. For this, he gives concept of service state. What does service state mean? Right? What does service state mean? It basically means this thing, right? Why you should why you should follow state? Why you should obey state? Why you should obey state? Service state is basically the concept that it is the answer of why you should obey state. You are obeying state because it is providing some service to you. It is fulfilling some needs of you, right? Right? Service state is basically the concept that you obey state because it provides some service to you. What service it provides? What service it provides? What needs does does the state fulfills? It basically fulfills the need of conflict resolution, right? It is basically the needs of conflict resolution. And to explain this limitation of state, that why one should follow state, because state is fulfilling some of our needs. If state is fulfilling some of our needs, why if state is fulfilling some of our needs and that is why we are following a state, this means that there are some limitations of state, right? There is only one reason because of which we are following the state. If there is only one reason, then we can have a different reason tomorrow to not follow state. So state has some limitations, right? To explain this limitation, Lasky says this one thing. Lasky says that state is not source of law. I am writing this in quotes, state is not source of law. State is not, I said Lasky, I guess. I am talking about MacIver. I am extremely sorry. I am talking about MacIver. I am not talking about Lasky. In explaining limitations of state, MacIver says that state is not source of law. It is also a child of law. What does this mean? Right? State is not a source of law. It is a child of law. This means that state forms due to constitution. Child of law means origin of state is in constitution. Origin of state is in constitution. Constitution will define limits of state. So state is limited. State is both child and guardian of law. Right? The second limitation of state, first limitation of state, it is limited by constitution. The second limitation of state is that it 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 is formed on basis of general will. Right? General will is not will of the state, but it is will of the people for the state. General will is not the will of the state, but it is will of the people for the state. Right? General will is usually seen in this point of view, whereby if an elected government, if an government is elected, it has basis of popular sovereignty. It can do whatever it wants. But this is not true. General will means general will means that people will allow state to do things, right? People want a type of law, state will make that law. It is the will of the people, it is the will of the people that state follows. General will is not the will of the state, but it is will of the people for the state, right? General will as a concept was misused by people like Hitler, right? And he assumed that if I am elected to the position of chancellor, I will do whatever I want to do, right? He assumed that he has general will of German people, and whatever he does is is the correct thing to do, and general German people will follow him in that. But MacIver says in the other way. He says that Hitler was not following his own will, or German state was not following their own will, but it was will of people which moved the state, right? So this was MacIver's concept of sovereignty, or MacIver's view on sovereignty, MacIver's view on state, right? The first thing that MacIver says is the limitation of state. He says that state cannot be the ultimate state cannot be the ultimate authority. Why? Because state is limited by the constitution. Right? This is the first limitation as explained by MacIver. The second limitation is with the concept of general will. General will, if you remember Rousseau, we have seen general will as popular sovereignty. What is popular sovereignty? That elections will happen, deliberation will happen, and real wills of people will come together to form a general will. General will is basically will of you, me, anyone coming together and forming an idea on basis of which state should move ahead. right? This this idea that general will is basically real wills of all the people within a territory led to people like Hitler thinking that I have ultimate power because I have general will of the German people, right? I will make a flowchart, I will make a feedback system to make you understand, right? What is general will? General will is basically summation of all the people of within a territory. So imagine I am writing this in millions. 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million people are in territory. They have real will R1, R2, R3, and R4. R1, R2, R3, and R4 are real wills of people within a territory. These these people will give their wills to the state, and state will form a general will. This general will, this general will, state assumes that, right, this is general will. On basis of the general will, right, suppose elections are the means through which general will is expressed, right? Elections, through elections you elect a government. Suppose this is Hitler's government. On basis of this general will, there are elections, and on basis of this election, Hitler was elected. Now, what Hitler assumed that he has general will of all these people, and he did whatever he wanted to do, right? But what MacIver says is this thing. He says that he says that Hitler's will, it is not general will. Hitler's will, it is not general will, but general will is will of German people. It is this 40 million people who has general will. It is not Hitler. So general will is not the will of the state, but it is will of the people for the state. So these people will say that I want this thing, this thing, this thing, but Hitler assumed that he he has will of all the people within Germany, which is simply not true. So general will is not the will of the state. If you are elected to election, you are elected by election, you cannot do whatever you want to do, right? You cannot carry out the government as per your will, but it is the people who decide what what you should do when you are in government, right? It is not the will of the state, but it is will of the people for the state. What does this mean? Will of the people for the state, right? This means this thing. This means this, that ultimate power is not with state, but ultimate power or sovereignty is with the people, right? State is just an instrument for people to express their will, right? So this was general will, and this was the concept of pluralist theory of sovereignty. This was the concept of service state. I hope you understood this. Now we'll start with pluralist basis of law. Pluralist basis of law, we'll see two people. The first people is the first person is not people. Leon Dugit says that, right? You have seen in Austin's this very famous statement we have seen, whereby Austin says that law is command of sovereign. John Austin says this law is command of sovereign. Law is command of sovereign. Leon Dugit says that law is not command of sovereign. Law is command of social solidarity. How law is command of social solidarity, right? Imagine a party A in power. Party A is in power, right? And party A makes a law which will which will uh, which will discriminate a lot of the society, right? Parliament makes a law which is discriminating most of the society. What these discriminated society will do is that they will go on protest. When these people go on protest, the law has to change. So law is not command of sovereign, it is command of social solidarity, as we have seen in example of Bangladesh. Who was sovereign in Bangladesh? It was Sheikh Hasina. Sheikh Hasina's Awami League had power in Bangladesh. Sheikh Hasina had power in Bangladesh. She makes a law which gives reservation to freedom fighters of Bangladesh, which gives reservation to descendants of freedom fighters of Bangladesh, right? And this reservation goes around 10% of the whole quota. And against this reservation system, we see massive protest happening. Massive protest happened against this reservation. So Sheikh Hasina, who was sovereign of Bangladesh, makes a law which gives a reservation to descendants of freedom fighters of Bangladesh. Against this law, people come together, conduct massive protest. What does Sheikh Hasina has to do? Sheikh Hasina has to leave Bangladesh and the law changes. So you understand that law is not command of sovereign. Law is command of social solidarity. You make a law which goes against interest of your subjects. You make a law which goes against interest of your people. They will kick your bosom. They will kick your bottom and kick you out of power. The next person who will come to power will change the law. So law is not command of the sovereign. It is basically law is command of social solidarity. Law is command of people. Law is command of majority. The second person, the second person to talk about pluralist basis of law. It is Hugo Crabbe. Hugo Crabbe talks about socialist basis of law. He talks about law has basis in social consciousness. Again, very similar concept. We have seen above example. This example also fits here. Law has basis in social consciousness. I will give you very simple example. I will give you very simple example of, let's say, something very progressive law. Let's say right to education law. Right to education law of 2005. Why right to education came? Because social consciousness of the time demanded it. So law has basis of social consciousness. Law has basis social consciousness. Law has origin in social consciousness. So this was sovereignty, and this was the multiple views on sovereignty. Now we are going to see impact of globalization on sovereignty. Impact of globalization on sovereignty. What is impact of globalization on sovereignty? How globalization has impacted sovereignty. This is our basic, this is our question. How globalization has impacted sovereignty. To understand to understand how globalization has impacted sovereignty, we have to understand one thing first, right? Impact of globalization on sovereignty. So as we were seeing impact of globalization on sovereignty, right? Sovereignty, we have seen what is sovereignty. Sovereignty is basically sovereignty is basically the ultimate authority of an entity within a territory, right? And globalization, on the other hand, is compression in time and space. It talks about borderless village, and it talks about borderless world and global village, right? So globalization as a concept talks about deterritorialization. I cannot pronounce it well, but deterritorialization, and sovereignty is a territorial concept. It is a territorial concept. Sovereignty works on territory, and globalization is deterritorialization of sovereignty. Right? I am not able to pronounce the word well, but I hope you understand it. Right? These are two antithetical things. One talks about deterritorial deterritorialization, and the other thing is territorial. Sovereignty is a territorial concept, and globalization is not. These two are two antithetical things, right? One talks about compression in time and space, one talks about borderless world, one talks about global village. Globalization as a concept talks about borderless world. Sovereignty is very much, it is very much formed on basis of formed on basis of borders only. One talks about borderless world, other is other concept is with borders. So two very antithetical things and two antithetical concepts, right? Two These are two opposite ideas. What globalization is? What is globalization? Globalization is an situation whereby you see a lot of export import happening. Countries open their borders, and globalization is a concept whereby you see a lot of ideas flowing as well, right? It is information and communication technology driven. It is MNC driven, right? The classical notion that state is the ultimate authority is no longer true. Globalization talks about state to be porous, right? State to be porous. What does it mean? Right? India as a state. If it was not porous, there was nothing that is coming out of it, or nothing that is going out of it, nothing that is coming in or nothing that is going out. If India was not porous, now India is porous, right? Goods, services are coming in, goods and services are going out, and ideas are also coming in. This globalization is due to or by entities such as NGOs, MNCs, right? Bretton Woods institutions of World Bank, of IMF, right? Then non-state actors, then entities like EU or ASEAN. All this has propelled globalization ahead. So when globalization happens, then NGOs, MNCs, Bretton Woods system, non-state actors, EU, ASEAN, all these entities will see an increase in their powers, and states will observe and decline in their powers. Right? State will observe and decline in their power. NGOs, MNC will become more important, and state will lose its importance as and decision making entity. So with respect to globalization and sovereignty, we have three schools of thought. The first school of thought, it is globalist school of thought. What does globalist will say? That this is true, that state has declined. A lot of decisions today are made by NGOs. A lot of decisions today are made by multinational companies, transnational companies. This is globalist view. The second view is state centrist view or anti-globalist view, whereby they will say state remains at core of decision making. State is still in command. And the third is transformationalist. Transformationalists have talked about the third thing, that state has transformed itself. State has transformed itself to be something else. We will see all of these one by one, starting with globalist. Globalist like Susan Strange in her book Retreat of the State. People like Kenichi Ohame, Marshall McLuhan talks about globalist globalist view on sovereignty, whereby they will talk about retreat of the state, decline of sovereignty. They will say that globalist will say that state has declined. They will say that state has rolled back, right? State has rolled back in economy, as more decisions are made by multinational companies, in politics, because a lot of decisions are made on global level, and on social sense, because when you travel to a lot of countries, your loyalty towards your own country is not there, right? You align yourself to either the country that you are in, or either your family or your caste or kin, right? Globalist view says that with globalization, State has declined. State has rolled back in economy, in politics, and in social sense as well. That sovereignty as a concept has declined. The second idea in relation between globalization and sovereignty is anti-declinist, anti-declinist or state-centric, state-centric view. State-centric view as given by Paul Hurst or Robert Gilpin. Robert Gilpin in his book The Challenge of Global Capitalism has talked has talked about state centrism in international politics. He says that, or anti-globalist or state centrist people say that, people like Robert Gilpin say that state is still in command, right? And globalization as an idea is not something which is new, right? We have seen Silk Route, right? Silk Route started from China, where they carried silk on back of donkeys to places like Europe, to places like Iran, Iraq, Persian Gulf, Persian area, right? Mesopotamia. So globalization is not something which is new. Globalization has been seen in ideas like Silk Route. So globalization is not something which is new, but and state still remains in power, right? State is still sovereign within its borders, right? And state and nationality still remains a strong sentiment, right? The first thing that anti-declinist, state-centrist, or anti-globalist will say, they will say that globalization is not something new. State is still in command. Nationality is still strong sentiment, right? And state is still sovereign within its borders. This is anti-declinist or state-centric view, right? The third view is transformationalist. Transformationalist view on sovereignty. This was given by David Held in his book Runaway World. Runaway World. People like this transformationalist people have said that sovereignty has transformed due to globalization, right? But sovereignty remains an important idea and important basis of power, right? There is this concept of zero sum game, right? Zero sum game. I am playing a game. There are two people, A and B. In zero sum game, either A will win or B will win, right? Both of them cannot be winners at the same time. They will say that globalization, the battle or game between globalization is not a zero sum game. It is not a zero sum game. It is not true. It is not true that If globalization wins, sovereignty has to lose. Right? Right? So we see economically state controls trade. State controls trade. State controls trade. Politically, politically we see that even in situations like European Union, whereby there is it is a union of states and there is central parliament in of European Union. Still, still states are sovereign, right? Then socially, he says that David Hill says that that sovereignty still remains the core principle on which states are recognized on, right? So the impact of globalization has a lot of point of views. Some say that globalization has changed sovereignty. Some will say sovereignty still remains intact, and other people will say that globalization has transformed sovereignty, right? So this was the view and importance of globalization on sovereignty. We have seen all three schools of thought: globalist school, anti-declinist school, and transformationalist school. But the impact of globalization in application, apart from theories, has not been equal. With globalization, you see some states are becoming stronger. States like China and India have become strong due to globalization. Our GDPs are increasing. But in recent times, you see GDP growth of US has declined. GDP growth of Europe has declined, right? So impact of globalization is not equal. Some state will some state will see growth and some state will see decline. Also, globalization is not a static idea, right? Global globalization has been continuously evolving. In before 2008, we see globalization around the world, whereby every country of the world was seeing growth, seeing growth and wanted to trade. Post-COVID, you see that states have started applying tariffs. There are a lot of duties on a lot of goods. China, China and US has seen tariff war. Then you see uh, US applying 50% tariff on us, right? So globalization as an idea is declining today, and with the things like tariff wars, globalization is declining, and sovereignty is becoming stronger again. People are talking about self self production, self consumption. Atmanirbhar Bharat is an exercise towards maintaining sovereignty, right? So that is there. Sovereignty today is on the stronger side than globalization. Globalization today is on decline because states are turning protectionist. This was sovereignty. This was sovereignty. This was impact of globalization on sovereignty. I hope you understood this. I will start with concept of state from the next lecture. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much.